Welcome to New Zealand. Here's a fun fact. Almost 80% of this beautiful country is completely empty of people, especially since New Zealand is bigger than most people think and has a great climate. The South Island and North Island are actually the 12th and 14th largest islands in the world. If you place them on the US East Coast, they would stretch from Florida to Pennsylvania. Together, these two main islands are even bigger than the entire United Kingdom. New Zealand has a climate a lot like the UK, with similar temperatures and rainfall throughout the year. Both places have an oceanic and temperate climate, meaning no dry season, warm summers and mild winters. If you look at a global map of this climate type, it includes some of the world's most densely populated areas like Western Europe, Vancouver, Mexico City, Lima, Cusco, Johannesburg, and parts of southeastern Australia. Despite having a climate nearly identical to the UK and being larger in size, New Zealand has way fewer people. The UK has nearly 69 million residents, while New Zealand has just over 5 million, about 14 times fewer. Even though New Zealand is bigger, it has a lower population than many smaller islands around the world, like Java, Honshu, and Great Britain, which have far more people living on them. To give you a sense of scale, the UK has an average population density of 281 people per square kilometre, while New Zealand is much more sparsely populated. In New Zealand, the population density is just 18 people per square kilometre, while in the UK it's 15 times higher. So why is New Zealand so much emptier despite having a similar size and climate? The reasons are complex and interesting, and the more you look into it, the stranger it seems. Remember, about 80% of New Zealand is completely uninhabited. Most of the people, over 3/4, live on the North Island, while less than a quarter live spread out over the larger South Island. The North Island is smaller but much more populated, with nearly half of its residents living around Auckland, New Zealand's biggest city. Auckland, located on an isthmus with good natural harbours and fertile soils, sits over a dormant volcanic field. This city alone is home to about 37% of New Zealand's population and is nearing 2 million people, making New Zealand one of the most centralized countries in the developed world. For comparison, let's look at some percentages of other countries' populations in their biggest cities. Including Auckland, the North Island hosts 4 of New Zealand's 5 largest cities. The largest city on the South Island is Christchurch, located on the flat plains of Canterbury. But if you exclude the area around Christchurch, the rest of the South Island is sparsely populated. The South Island of New Zealand is about the same size as the Netherlands plus half of Belgium, but is almost empty with only about 5.4 people per square kilometre, similar to the Dakotas in the US. This is surprising because in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the South Island actually had more people than the North Island. The main reason for New Zealand's sparse population is its isolation. It's almost in the center of the water hemisphere, with Australia being the closest large landmass, nearly 2,000 kilometers away across the Tasman Sea. Beyond that, it's surrounded by scattered islands, Antarctica, and vast stretches of open ocean. Even today, the South Pacific has very little air and maritime traffic. A flight from Auckland to Sydney takes almost 4 hours, similar to flying from London to Athens. For much of Europe, New Zealand is practically the furthest place you can go without leaving the planet, as it's on the opposite side of the world from Spain and Portugal. Getting to or from New Zealand simply takes a lot of time. Even in the 21st century, New Zealand's extreme isolation from the rest of the world means it was destined to be the last large habitable landmass discovered by humans. It remained untouched by humans until a group of Polynesian explorers stumbled upon it by chance in the 13th century, around the time Genghis Khan was conquering Eurasia. These explorers became the Maori, developing a unique culture on the islands. The Maori lived undisturbed until the mid-17th century, when a Dutch sailor became the first non-Polynesian to discover New Zealand. However, lasting European contact didn't begin until 1769, when British sailor Captain Cook visited, nearly 500 years after the Maori had settled. Simply put, other islands like Great Britain, Java and Honshu have had much more time to grow their populations. These islands were settled thousands of years earlier because they are closer to major continental landmasses. As recently as the 13th century, New Zealand had 0 human inhabitants, while places like Japan were already thriving. Back in the days, Great Britain's population was already in the millions, whereas New Zealand's population only reached that in the 21st century. More people lead to more growth over time, but the Maori started from scratch just 800 years ago, which isn't that long historically. Modern estimates, based on guesswork, suggest the Maori population was around 200,000 by the time the British arrived. When the British formally took over New Zealand in 1840, many British and Irish immigrants began to arrive. The Maori population suffered greatly due to European diseases, warfare, and an unfamiliar legal system. Their numbers dropped from 200,000 in 1769 to about 40,000 by 1890, while around 500,000 Europeans had moved to New Zealand by then. Initially, most European settlers chose the South Island because the North Island had more Maori and more conflict, plus gold was discovered in the south. It wasn't until the 20th century that the North Island's population surpassed the south. Today, over 3/4 of New Zealanders live on the North Island. One reason for this is the South Island's terrain. It's much more mountainous, making it harder to build on. New Zealand sits on the boundary between the Pacific and Australian tectonic plates, which makes the South Island especially rugged. Beneath the South Island, the Pacific plate is colliding with and sliding under the Australian plate. This collision, over the past 45 million years, has pushed up 20 kilometers of rock to form the Southern Alps, which stretch almost the entire length of the island. These mountains are comparable in size to the Alps in Europe, with 18 peaks over 3,000 meters high. The tallest peak, over 3,700 meters, is nearly as high as Japan's Mount Fuji. For comparison, Australia's highest mountain, Mount Kosciuszko, is about 1,500 meters shorter. Developing these massive mountains is tough because building around or through them is more expensive and labor-intensive than on flatter land. The Southern Alps also take up a lot of space on the South Island and create additional challenges for development. They stretch for about 500 kilometers and leave a narrow strip of land to the west exposed to prevailing westerly winds from the Tasman Sea. These winds bring moist air that hits the mountains, causing heavy rainfall on the western side. As the air crosses the mountains, it loses moisture, becoming hot and dry as it descends on the eastern side. This means the mountains not only occupy a lot of space, but also create a rain shadow, making the eastern plains drier and less ideal for development. This makes the eastern side of the island generally dry and prone to droughts, making it hard to grow crops. While the land is flatter and easier to develop, the lack of rain makes agriculture tough. On the western side, the terrain is rugged with limited flat land and too much rain. The North Island, while still mountainous, is less so than the South Island. It has more flat land that's easier to develop and receives more evenly distributed and predictable rainfall because there aren't as many big mountains disrupting the weather. Being further north and closer to the equator, the North Island has warmer temperatures compared to the South Island. Though both islands have volcanoes, those on the South Island are dormant and haven't erupted in centuries. In contrast, the North Island's volcanoes are still active, with occasional small eruptions over the past few decades, which have added some fertile volcanic soils to the land. This combination of flatter land, more reliable rainfall, warmer temperatures, and better soils makes the North Island more suitable for agriculture and sustaining a larger population. So, after the South Island's gold ran out and the violence in the North Island ended, it was inevitable that the North Island would end up with more than 3/4 of New Zealand's population. However, the North Island's capacity to host a large population isn't limitless. Volcanic eruptions, while adding minerals to the soil, are rare and minor. There have only been 13 significant volcanic eruptions in New Zealand in the past 1,800 years, with just 4 minor eruptions on the North Island in the past century. By comparison, Japan experiences an average of 15 volcanic events every year. Since 2018, just one of the many active volcanoes on the Indonesian island of Java has erupted 6 times. This frequent volcanic activity in places like Indonesia and Japan deposits minerals into the soil more regularly, making their land more fertile and better for growing crops compared to New Zealand, where volcanic activity is rare. Consequently, New Zealand's soil isn't naturally fertilized as often. With all its mountains, dormant volcanoes, hills and arid plains, plus irregular rainfall and poor soil quality, most of New Zealand isn't ideal for growing crops. In fact, less than 2% of the country's land is considered arable, which is comparable to desert countries like Jordan and Somalia. However, unlike those desert countries, New Zealand's temperate climate, available water and abundant grasslands make it perfect for grazing and ranching. Instead of focusing on crops, New Zealand has built its agricultural industry around livestock. The meme about there being more sheep than people in New Zealand is true. There are nearly 27 million sheep compared to just 5.1 million people. This has made New Zealand the world's top exporter of sheep products like wool and mutton, but sheep aren't their only livestock. New Zealand has more than twice as many cows as people, making dairy products their largest export. Despite only 2% of the land being suitable for crops, 55% of New Zealand's land is used for agriculture, primarily for raising sheep and cows. Basically, New Zealand's geography pushed it into becoming like a big European ranch. After the gold rush in the late 19th century, there wasn't much else to mine or drill for, and the land wasn't great for growing crops. Plus, being far from major markets meant they couldn't really compete in manufacturing like Japan or the UK. So, New Zealand focused on what it's good at: raising animals. They've become pros at producing sheep and cows, which they trade for other stuff like manufactured goods and oil. In fact, they produce so much food that they can feed about 40 million people a year, 8 times their population. Since they don't need that much food, they export about 95% of it to over 100 countries, earning billions of dollars. Animal farming has been New Zealand's main money maker for almost 200 years, and it'll probably stay that way. But because so much land is used for farming, there's not a lot left for people to spread out and live on. Also, like in other developed countries, birth rates in New Zealand have dropped below the replacement level. But compared to places like Germany or Japan, New Zealand's birth rate is still higher. And unlike Japan or South Korea, New Zealand has a long history of immigration. Most people living there today are descendants of immigrants who arrived over the past 200 years. At first, immigration was restricted to white people, but that's changed, and now more immigrants are coming in, which is speeding up population growth. Well, it wasn't easy getting people to move to the faraway land of New Zealand. It took centuries for the population to even reach 1 million around 1911. Racist policies that limited non-white immigration only eased up after World War II. So, it took another 45 years to hit 2 million, then 20 more for 3 million, and another 30 for 4 million. But things sped up after that. It only took 14 years to add another million and hit 5 million by 2020. Most of the recent growth came from immigration. Starting in 2008, the government aimed for 45,000 new immigrants a year, plus up to 5,000 more. Between 2013 and 2018, 270,000 new immigrants arrived from all over the world. The UK is still the biggest source of immigrants, but nowadays most come from Asia, especially China, India, and the Philippines. Over 27% of New Zealand's population was born outside the country, a rate that's among the highest in the world and likely to keep rising. But these newcomers mostly settle in Auckland, the biggest city with the best flight connections. Between 1996 and 2016, over half of New Zealand's population growth happened around Auckland. But this rapid growth has its downsides, like soaring house prices. By 2022, the average house in Auckland cost over $1.1 million, while the average salary was just $44,000, making it one of the least affordable cities in the world. So while much of New Zealand remains empty, the parts that are inhabited struggle with housing. But the government's careful about how many people they let in each year, understanding the limits of their islands. It's a fascinating place with unique challenges, and who knows how much more populated it'll get in the future. Thanks for watching. I hope you like our today's video. Please consider subscribing our channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our future videos.